Hello, this lecture is on communists and fascists. The end of World War I did not mean the end of upheaval for Europe and the new Russia. The war shook Europe to its core. Countless Europeans were disillusioned by their experience. The rise of the totalitarian dictatorships of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union was worrisome news. The Soviet Union and Italy ended up stealing the freedom of millions. The Italian fascists and the Soviet communists shared a theme for violence and a belief in a command system in which the economy was controlled by the state. Both these left-wing regimes opposed free market capitalism. The Enlightenment promise of a better world based on rationalism and the unaided intellect of elites became dubious. Sociologist Peter Berger wrote that the socialist program is based on all the standard cognitive assumptions of modernity. History as progress, an idea which must be understood as a secularization of biblical eschatology, the perfectibility of man, scientific reason as the great liberator from illusion, and man's ability to overcome all or nearly all of his afflictions by taking rational control of his destiny, end of quote. Socialist thinking aligns with the unconstrained vision articulated by economist Thomas Sowell. Elites know better. Historian Richard Pipe argues that it is difficult to make any clear distinction between socialism and communism. Communism refers to an ideal, a program, and a regime set up to realize the ideal. The ideal is the realization of full social equality that is achieved by the termination of individualism in the community. This means no private property. The modern program of communism began with the work of socialist activists such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The claim was that the program was scientific. According to Pipes, the contribution of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to socialism was a theory that purported to show why the kingdom of equality was not only desirable and feasible, but inevitable. Russia was the first example of communism set up with the full power of the state. In the 1870s, the socialist doctrines of Western Europe began to influence Russian activists. A small group of radical youth formed the People's Will Party with the key goal of bringing the Tsar down by way of political terrorism. The socialist revolutionaries assassinated Tsar Nicholas II in 1881. But this action backfired because much of the Russian population opposed such terror methods. In 1903, activists hoping to pave the road to socialism formed the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The party had two factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the latter led by Vladimir Lenin. Born in 1870, Vladimir Lenin came from a well-to-do family. When he was younger, his brother was executed for building a bomb and conspiring to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. While attending the University of Kazan, Vladimir participated in a student disturbance that resulted in his expulsion from university. He was bitter with resentment, and he became a lawyer, and he had passed an external examination to get his law degree. Impatient with moderate strategies, he longed for revolution directed by elites with the proper revolutionary credentials. Although a dedicated follower of Marx, Lenin believed that the industrial workers desperately needed the leadership of an organized party to reach revolutionary consciousness. In other words, he believed a revolution could be manufactured. Between the years 1900 and 1917, Lenin spent most of his time outside of Russia. With the arrival of World War I, he argued that the war between nations must be instead a war between classes. Workers of all nations needed to turn their guns against their exploiters. In other words, English, French, and German workers would join together and fight English, French, and German business leaders. This position was nonsense, but Lenin bided his time as the German armies conquered valuable Russian land. Russia's military defeats and terrible economic conditions led to Tsar Nicholas II stepping down from power in early 1917. The February Revolution put in place a provisional government that was dedicated to reform, but the new government was poorly prepared to fight the war. The government's decision to ignore popular demands to end the war doomed it from the start. Demonstrating his practical political gifts, Lenin embraced the motto, peace, land, and bread. In an almost bloodless coup, he and the Bolsheviks seized control in the October Revolution. The German-imposed Treaty of Brest-Litovsk forced Russia out of the war and proved to be as harsh as the later Treaty of Versailles. When Vladimir Lenin wrested control of Russia, he was a fierce little man in his late 40s with a bull neck. Lenin had a grim lack of humanity, showing little care for those around him. He was serious and driven, caring only for the cause of revolutionary socialism. In his early 20s, Lenin told his associates not to collect money for victims of famine on the grounds that hunger performs a progressive function and would cause the peasants to reflect on the fundamental facts of capitalist society. In other words, if people suffered, socialism had a better chance to grow. Lenin's thinking suggests that increasing the power of socialism was far more important than the economic well-being of the common masses. Lenin had an obsession for force. Revolutions are the feast days of the oppressed classes, he said. Lenin believed that Russian peasants, like urban workers, desperately needed the leadership of an organized party to reach revolutionary consciousness. The goal was to build a perfected form of socialism known as communism. With the Bolsheviks in control of Russia, they closed down newspapers and all schools were taken from the church and handed over to the state. The state took control of the banks, and there was immediate nationalization of all factories. Opposition was met with violence. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's chief military agent, declared, "We shall not enter into the kingdom of socialism in white gloves on a polished floor." Lenin's secret police executed people often based on rumored wrongdoing. He advocated shooting on the spot 1 out of every 10 people found idling. The state newspaper declared, "Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds, let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. Let there be floods of blood of the bourgeois." In Russia, the modern practice of genocide was born. Of course, there was opposition to the socialists. A bloody civil war, red versus white, broke out in Russia. More than 200,000 counter-revolutionaries, including Nicholas II and the royal family, were eliminated by Lenin's secret police. The demands of the Civil War led to war communism and a radical restructuring of Russian social and economic life. The so-called transitory dictatorship of the proletariat began to take on the form of a permanent dictatorship. Industrial production dropped drastically during the Civil War. Lenin was ignorant of the process whereby wealth is created. He thought that provided he got the system of control right, the results would flow inevitably. This did not happen. The economy was in ruins. In the winter of 1921-22, approximately 3 million people died of famine, the first in Russian history to be substantially created by government policy. Much too late, Lenin implemented free market reforms as part of his new economic policy in 1921. Although after a prolonged period of illness, he died in 1924. Joseph Stalin came out on top in the power struggle after Lenin's death and decided that the Soviet Union needed a second revolution, in this case, an industrial one. 5-year plans and collectivization brought Russian industry and agriculture firmly under Stalin's control. Russia did industrialize, but at a very steep economic and social price. In 1934, Stalin turned against his real and perceived enemies in the Great Purge. Millions of Soviet citizens died either directly or indirectly from Stalinist terror. Consistent with other socialist ideologues, the Bolshevik leaders saw Christianity as a threat. Vladimir Lenin has claimed that all worship of a divinity is necrophilia. He helped create groups such as the Society of the Godless. He wrote that any religious idea, any idea of any God at all, any flirtation, even with a God, is the most inexpressible foulness, the most dangerous foulness, end of quote. Obedience to the state meant no religious distractions. Karl Marx had despised religion, but he treated it as marginal. Lenin despised religion, but he treated it as a powerful enemy. It is notable that he had no feelings about corrupt Russian priests. They were easily beaten. Historian Paul Johnson declares that the men he really feared and hated and later persecuted were the saints. The purer the religion, the more dangerous. Joseph Stalin likewise hated Christianity. The following is a list of major assaults on Christianity that eventually took place in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 1, all land and buildings were confiscated from the Russian Orthodox Church. 2, all schools were taken from the church and handed over to the state. 3, marriage was transformed into a strictly civil secular ceremony. 4, weddings, baptisms, and funerals were replaced by bizarre communist ceremonies. 5, the church's long-standing prohibition against divorce was lifted. 6, churches were destroyed or transformed into clubs, workshops, and storage houses. For example, the beautiful church of the Archangel Michael, built in the 1740s, was used to store grain. As late as the 1980s, there was not a single Catholic monastery, convent, school, or welfare institution in the entire Soviet Union. Soviet public school system indoctrinated young children with cruel gimmicks. It was essential for the children to turn against religion. For example, a teacher would ask a room of hungry students if they would like a loaf of bread, then lead the class in prayer for the bread. After their prayers, the students would wait and wait. but no bread would come. The teacher then changed how the students prayed. They would then pray to the state and its current rulers, and the bread would be walked miraculously into the room. Also in schools, children were taught that Christ did not rise from the dead. He did not walk from his tomb. His body was removed from the tomb by wild dogs. The dogs ate his flesh and took and buried his bones. In essence, with revolutionary socialism, Marx was the Messiah. The socialists understood the importance of denying the biblical record of Christ's time on earth. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 14, Paul wrote, "And if Christ wasn't raised to life, our message is worthless, and so is your faith." Now turning to fascism. Fascism is any political or social ideology which relies on the brutal use of force for getting and keeping power. It is a form of socialism, but in practice, it is much more sophisticated and clever application of it. The roots of fascism are in the romantic nationalism of the 18th century, and quote, in the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who properly deserves to be called the father of modern fascism, end of quote. After World War I, fascists and others pointed to the chaos and blamed democratic capitalism. Dynamic new leaders promoting fascist doctrines appealed to many people dissatisfied with their lot in life. Fascism, in a confusing and curious creation that is both anti-democratic and anti-Marxist. For disgruntled Europeans in the wake of the Great War, it promised to steer a clear course between the uncertainties of democratic capitalism and communism. The left-wing phenomenon was to be a better way. With orthodox socialism, the state has clear ownership of the means of production. However, this means that the state suffers all the problems that accompany the ownership of wealth. Let us take the example of a horse. A communist regime must feed, groom, and take care of it. Fascism is a smarter form of state control. Unlike the socialist masters, the fascist masters are not burdened with the same responsibility. Under fascism, the state does not seek to become the owner of the horse. It only seeks to have control over the horse and to use the horse when desired. Thus, the legal title of ownership is left in the hands of the original owners, and the state simply enacts laws which, under the threat of punishment, tell the owners what to do with their own property, how to use it, and even when they may use it. Ownership in such a situation is obviously just a fiction. For the very purpose of ownership is to guarantee the owner effective control over what he owns. But effective ownership is cleverly usurped under fascism. Even though it is ultimately big government, fascism is cloaked in propaganda so that many people are convinced that it is right-wing. Fascism opposes free market capitalism where individuals do business without the state having control. Unlike conservatives, fascists don't believe in full economic freedom. There are at least 4 identifying characteristics of fascism. First, fascism is ultra-nationalistic and autocratic. Fascism demands that individuals subordinate themselves to the state. Individuals in a fascist regime lack the freedoms of those living under democratic capitalist governments. Fascism is autocratic, where the will of the people is represented by a charismatic individual. Anti-democratic, fascism upholds the importance of the leader over everyone. Both a communist and fascist leader have control over the people, but the totalitarianism of communism desires global reach, whereas the totalitarianism of fascism is nationalist. 2, fascism does not appeal to scientific theory of society. Instead, it promotes irrationalism. More attention is paid to propaganda of hatred and resentment than reasoned discourse. By celebrating irrationalism, fascism appeals to angry youth who believe a powerful state can fix problems. When one speaks of irrationalism, one must refer to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche argued that all human behavior is basically motivated by the will to power. He saw that the true forces of life were the mysterious world of instincts and desires. Nietzsche spoke of a higher type of man, a superman who creates his own values. Supermen were those who spurned humanitarian sentiments and any sign of meekness and humility. Nietzsche wrote that God is dead. In fact, he believed that only a new elite of supermen could save European society from decadence. Fascists embraced many of Nietzsche's arguments. 3, fascism favors militarism and war. There's no room for pacifism. Courage, sacrifice, and great efforts of will are exalted. Wartime heroism occurs through aggressiveness. According to Mussolini, war alone brings all human energies to their highest state of tension and stamps with the seal of nobility the nations which have to face it. End of quote. 4, fascism permits private ownership of property, but not capitalism as practiced in a democracy. Fascist economic doctrine was based on centralized decision-making that uphold the highest interests of the state. The motto of Benito Mussolini was everything in the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state. Mussolini admitted the intellectual affinities of fascism and communism. He writes, quote, like you, we consider necessary a centralized and unitary state which imposes iron discipline on all persons, with this difference that you reach this conclusion by way of the concept of class, and we by way of the concept of nation. End of quote. Italy began World War I on side with Germany, but it switched sides. Although Italy was one of the victorious allies of World War I, it was a poor nation after the war. Italians also felt cheated by the peace settlement of the Versailles Treaty. They were denied territory that they believed they had earned through their war sacrifices. In the immediate post-war years, there was parliamentary chaos and economic instability. Benito Mussolini, born in 1883, was an exceptional writer. His political formulation was fundamentally Marxist. At a young age, he met Angelika Balbanov, a revolutionary socialist who came from a Russian aristocratic family. The Russian socialists assisted Mussolini with his socialist activities and education. He developed great admiration for Nietzsche's promotion of heroism and militarism. Mussolini's socialism was more aligned with the moderate socialism of Giuseppe Mazzini, who decades earlier fought for Italian independence. Mussolini used newspapers and his writings to stir political passions. He became one of the most effective and widely read socialist journalists in Europe. He became the successful editor of the left-wing newspaper Avanti, based in Milan. World War I ended his editorialship. He lost his job when he opposed Italy's early support for Germany and Austria. He eventually served in the army with distinction at the front against Austria. At the end of the war, Mussolini's politics became increasingly nationalistic. In 1919, Mussolini launched the Fascist Party. Like Vladimir Lenin, he promoted the formation of elites to engage the sentiment of the masses. The proletariat could not organize itself. His major followers included gangs of working class thugs and demobilized soldiers known as combat bundles or squads. This referring to unity. In unity, there is strength. These fascisti challenged any group that got in their way, including traditional socialists and communists. Mussolini was interested in creating a new socialism, a socialism in one state, a national socialism. The fight between fascists and socialists was not necessarily over ideology. Both groups adhered to the idea of a centrally controlled socialist economy. Each group wanted sole power and thus saw each other as the enemy. The Fascist Party focused on nationalistic goals and social economic transformation. The fascists talked of partial seizure of financial capital. They wanted to control the economy with economic councils. They began overthrowing city governments as the first step to national control. The fascists did not consistently honor the ballot box, instead preferring destruction and violence. They attacked their political enemies, destroying the private property of those who opposed them. The fascists suppressed their opponents by kidnapping and torture. One form of torture was to force large quantities of castor oil down the throats of their victims. In city and in rural settings, people were terrorized. The fascists carried out their famous March on Rome in October 1922, mobilizing 30,000 of his black-shirted followers in disciplined formation. Mussolini sent them from Milan to Rome. The show of force was enough to win him the backing of many non-fascists. Italian leaders caved to the threat of the fascists and allowed Mussolini to form a government. When the fascists did use votes, a parliamentary majority was achieved by using tactics of intimidation. Opponents were murdered or silenced. By the mid-1920s, the fascists controlled Italy. They suppressed a free press, created a secret police force, and they transformed social and economic policies. Other political parties had been destroyed. Mussolini made Italy into a one-party dictatorship and lost with any chance of democratic capitalism. Historian Paul Johnson refers to Italian fascism as a Marxist heresy. A book on fascism claims that Stalin stumbled on a brilliant tactic of simply labeling all inconvenient ideas and movement fascist. Socialists and progressives aligned with Moscow were called socialists and progressives, while socialists disloyal or opposed to Moscow were called fascists. Mussolini was an atheist who despised Christianity. He enjoyed ridiculing Jesus, calling him an ignorant Jew, a pygmy compared to Buddha. One of his favorite tricks was to publicly dare God to strike him dead, if he existed. But Mussolini understood the importance of the Catholic Church in securing his power. When Italy was unified in 1870, the Pope had been deprived of his territories in Rome. This became known as the Roman question. Mussolini settled the issue in 1929 when he granted the Pope sovereignty over the territory around the Vatican. The role of the Catholic Church in education was protected, and Italian marriage laws were guaranteed conformity with Catholic dogma. However, the Vatican was not always warm to Mussolini. In his 1931 encyclical, Pope Pius declared, "And here we find ourselves confronted by a mass of authentic affirmations and no less authentic facts which reveal beyond the slightest possibility of doubt the result, already in great measure actually put into effect, to monopolize completely the young from their tenderest years to manhood and womanhood for the exclusive advantage of a party and of a regime based on an ideology which clearly resolves itself into a real pagan worship of the state. The state toleratory, which is no less in contrast with the natural rights of family than it is in contradiction with the supernatural rights of the church." Despite the opposition of some, Mussolini remained a popular leader for much of the 1930s. Supporters praised the new sense of order and accomplishment in Italian society and economy. In the 1930s, some other European countries likewise adopted a form of socialism, a form of fascism. When the French and British became hostile over Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, North Africa, in late 1935, Mussolini began to have closer relations with Hitler and the National Socialists. In 1937, Mussolini joined the anti-Comintern pact with Germany and Japan, and that is against Russia. To conclude, the totalitarianism of Russia and subsequently Soviet Union and Italy was a shocking development. Both the fascists and communists were violent ideologues who operated a command system in which the economy and society was controlled by the state. Enlightenment thinking had reared its ugly head. Thank you.